This is the beginning of chapter 16, Proverbs. The preparations of the heart in man, and the answer of the tongue, is from the Lord. All the ways of a man are clean in his own eyes, but the Lord weighs the spirits. Commit your works to the Lord, and your thoughts shall be established. The Lord has made all things for himself, yea, even the wicked for the day of evil. Every one that is proud in heart is an abomination to the Lord. Though hand join in hand, he shall not be unpunished. By mercy and truth iniquity is purged, and by the fear of the Lord men depart from evil. When a man's ways please the Lord, he maketh even his enemies to be at peace with him. Better is a little with righteousness than great revenues without right. A man's heart devises his own way, but the Lord directeth his steps. A divine sentence is in the lips of the king. His mouth transgresses not in judgment. A just weight and balance are the Lord's. All the weights of the bag are his work. It is an abomination to kings to commit wickedness, for the throne is established by righteousness. Righteous lips are in the delight of kings, and they live him that speaketh right. The wrath of a king is as messengers of death, but a wise man will pacify it. And the light of the king's countenance is life, and his favor is as a cloud of the latter rain. How much better is it to get wisdom than gold, and to get understanding rather to be chosen than silver? The highway of the upright is to depart from evil. He that keeps his way preserves his soul. Pride goes before destruction, and an haughty spirit before a fall. Better it is to be of a humble spirit with the lowly, than to divide the spoil with the proud. He that handleth a matter wisely shall find good, and whoso trusteth in the Lord, happy is he. The wise in heart shall be called prudent, and the sweetness of the lips increaseth learning. Understanding is a wellspring of life unto him that has it, but the instruction of fools is folly. The heart of the wise teaches his mouth, and addeth learning to his lips. Pleasant words are as a honeycomb, sweet to the soul, and health to the bones. There is a way that seems right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. He that labours for himself, for his mouth craveth it of him. An ungodly man diggeth up evil, and in his lips there is as a fire burning. A froward man soweth strife, and a whisperer separateth chief friends. A violent man entices his neighbor, and leads him into the way that is not good. He shutteth his eyes to devise froward things. Moving his lips, he bringeth evil to pass. The hoary head is a crown of glory, if it be found in the way of righteousness. He that is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he that ruleth his spirit than he that taketh a city. The lot is cast into the lap, but the whole disposing thereof is of the Lord. So I was considering giving an interesting intro. I have a particular feeling that I've had, except it's not quite consolidated. It's just a general feeling. about this or that, nothing quite profound. And so I think I'll forgo it for now. Perhaps I'll return to it. But one thing that does come to mind is the expression, the old woodworking expression, against the grain. But I'll leave it at that. So to begin here with verse 1 of chapter 16. The preparations of the heart in man and the answer of the tongue is from the Lord. So I think here it's important to mention at the outset that we ought not to be thinking in a material sense here. I think it's easy, especially in the modern day, to slip into it when we are reading the Bible or certain types of literature. And it's not that we should deny that point of view, but to confound the 2 points of view, I think, can lead to a reduction in meaning. And if anything, the Bible offers is meaning. And so what can we say of this preparation of the heart in man? What does it mean for the heart to be prepared? Well, if we imagine this heart of ours, this seat of our desires, a degree of agency to its own, it has its own wisdom and directed force. Perhaps it's part of the broader condition that is man, part of the broader thing that is his soul, but it is not the totality of him. It is but a piece of him, an organ of meaning, let's say. And this organ of meaning, as opposed to its material organ composition and definition, the preparation that it has, the organization that represents this thing, this interpretive structure that feels through this environment, that assists us in intuiting the world and making sense of the world, of illuminating it. These are the preparations that we are talking about. And these preparations have been designed. Just as one prepares to make a cake, the ingredients are all put together. And when the ingredients are put together, it is then that we have this cake. And I think in the same way, the heart is prepared. The ingredients are designed by some conscious force and experience. Again, getting away from the material example, what we are concerned about is the pattern of this heart. Our language does reach into the physical, but our meaning must remain in the spiritual. And the answer of the tongue is from the Lord. And so we have another analogy, the answer of the tongue. Now this could be a response to a question, or it could be the truthfulness of the very thing that man uses to communicate to other people, the very mechanism, framework by which he thinks about the world and makes sense of it. This again is from that conscious directed source that we call God, that we call the Lord. And perhaps here comes in my analogy from the outset against the grain, that if you run your finger across a piece of wood, you'll have a smooth side and a side that is prickly. Perhaps it'll give you splinters, that is against the grain. And this sharp underbelly of life is the source of many of our insecurities, of our anxieties. And in the absence of answers, and in the torrent of the insecure heart, I think it is in these cases that we are tested, but it prompts us to find the answer. Now within this prompting, I have to imagine some source. Now the source, at the very least, we can say, is the general makeup of the various elements. They're organized in such a way that allows this prompting to take place. But what of it? Surely this prompting ought to prompt us towards action. But not in every case does it prompt us towards goodness. And at this crossroads between action, or perhaps after the decision of action by the prompting of the heart, because of its structure, because of how it was made, how it is prepared, because of the elements that comprise the nature of man, when we reach this crossroad between goodness of action and the otherwise, the other path, we exercise our will. And it should not be confused that in this crossroad, in this instance, in this decision, that this is from the Lord. It may be directed by God. But specifically in this verse, we are talking about the principle, the root. We're talking about the pillar that is our nature. All the ways of man are clean in his own eyes, but the Lord weigheth the spirits. And this is exactly what I was talking about. A man, in his own way, interprets goodness. C.S. Lewis talks about misplaced goods as our evils. For even the most evil of people consider what they are doing to be a good thing. It is good to them in their eyes. And so in this first part of this verse, all the ways of man are clean in his own eyes, this is relativism. That is to say, the doctrine of truth. All that is knowable, our morality, is not absolute. And it's dependent upon certain contextual things, conventional things from our culture, our society, historical things. And what we see here is that it is not the case, that there is a truth to be known, because it says, but the Lord weighs the spirits. And I think at the moment, it's useful not to think about the Lord or God as us. Now there is a degree to which there is a similarity, as we know from being made in the image of God. But the image perhaps is not as straightforward as we see it in the mirror. The image perhaps is similar to the analogy if I look out my window at all these noisy cars that are passing by, and now seeing that it is nighttime, I can view out and I could see the street lamps that illuminate the street and the surrounding environment. And I think it is in this way that we are in the image of God. That is, we are able to see, perhaps not in the physical sense, not in our physical environment, but that seeing is a type of illumination. It is a relationship to our conscious mind and our perception, the agent that is us. It is this perceiving agent that is in the like image to our Creator. And so the seeing agent, he weighs the spirits. What does this mean? Well, perhaps if we think about, now there is a way that I have been using spirit, but I'd like to, before I get to that image, explore another path of spirit. When we think of spirit, we think of immaterial. We think a part of ourselves that is, or that can transcend material reality, that retains this agency, this conscious, directed perception, that it is able to intuit and make intelligible to it the world and the environment that it finds itself in. Now, I had a dream the other day about the world that we may be entering into, this artificial intelligence assisted, perhaps directed, tyrannized world. And the vision that I had was quite bizarre. And this bizarreness makes me question my own mind and why it did not at first imagine heaven in such a scenario rather than that of the artificially expansive application to the existing conscious mind. But what I found was a reality in which nothing was hidden. Everything was known. Communication was so quick and so instant that it was almost as if the power of the mind had been amplified. It's as if we were living in the world of spirits, sort of disconnected from the embodied sense of the world. And in this dream, I had a connection with a person that is no longer of this world, no longer embodied, and this connection was quite personal. It's quite intimate. It was such that the person still existed in the sense that I had known that person to exist. And I think at the very least that dream gave me an insight, something to relate to when I hear this verse. That the Lord weighs the spirits, that of this mind, of this supreme mind, living in an environment of such speed and awareness, that the intelligible sphere is all known. And the creation within this intelligible sphere, these spirits that float within it, that have their own boundaries, their own identities, they are in some sense compared. I think that compare is a good word to begin with, but it's certainly not one that we should end on. When I think of weigh the spirits, I think of compare. But also, I think of the scales of justice. That has a more elevated context to it. It has an ethical, a moral component and dimension to it. It adds to the comparison, specifies it. That it is because the very existence of the intelligible sphere that things are able to be weighed at all. When I think of weighing something in the spiritual realm, I think of determining some constant in its being just as if we were to weigh something here on Earth in a physical context. We do so sort of out of economic concerns, that we might want to trade something for something else that we could then use to buy something else. And that this weight that it has is a constant of its makeup. And it's within this constancy that I find this principle. The spirit, of course, is not just an inanimate thing. Even if it is produced by the hand of man, is still much separated from that material object. And the principle of constancy, as it applies to the spirit, relates not to its physical weight, but again to its being, to the decisions that are associated, that are attributed to it, the recognition of its own identity and the will therein. And again, everything that we had heard in the first verse. The organization of that thing that allowed it to perceive, the preparations of the heart, the answering of the tongue. And so this is saying, despite what we may believe, there is an absolute. And the decisions that we make do have consequences, both in this life and in the next. How can we perceive of the next life? That's difficult. I think the Psalms are good at explaining at least a degree of it. For we know that just as in life as in death, there are similarities. Certainly when we think of things like hell or Sheol, it's much more difficult to think of things like heaven after life of one particular individual. But these are matters that we will come to in the future. Certainly we can imagine the continuation of a particular direction on earth beyond that of one individual's lifespan. But for that individual, within that intelligible sphere, it's quite the thing to imagine. When I say that intelligible sphere, I mean the intelligible sphere that transcends life and death, that transcends the individual experience. Commit your works unto the Lord, and your thoughts shall be established. And so the theme continues here. Commit your works unto the Lord, and your thoughts shall be established. Beginning with the second half of this verse, and your thoughts shall be established, we are talking about an intelligible sphere again. For in what way will these thoughts be established? Now, the most obvious is that a thought can be materialized. A plan can be made actionable. A house can be built. A family can be raised. Relationships can be born and formed and nourished, solidified. But is it the case that this word established is only referring to the materialization of our thoughts? Or is it, like in the previous verse, we have this image of the transcendent sphere of consciousness, that perhaps after the death of the body of the individual, that transcendent sphere remembers that experience of life, and perhaps in some way that experience continues in that place beyond space and beyond time. However minuscule it might be, however simple the pattern might be, whether it be an animal or a person with a severe intellectual disability. There is organization. Now this is in the material sense. There's organization within the brain that allows certain things to take place. Certain patterns perhaps are not all that useful, but useful might not be the right way. Certain patterns might not be enough to make sophisticated intuitions or connections about the world and reality. Who's to say that sufficient connections and patterns are enough to provide one's worth in that spiritual waiting sense that God is doing? To be established is to have a place in. Something has been set up. And we have to pay attention to that language there. It's very colloquial and conventional at this point. But to set something is to freeze it in a certain sense. Just like we were talking about in the place beyond time and space. That the intelligible sphere is able to set things. Now, given all the constraints of the natural world, there are plenty of different laws that we have to set things. But in the beyond, or even in this case, let's focus on that word, to set up. To make a boundary, to make something have its identity, and then to raise it up. I think what we are saying is we are raising it in the intelligible sphere. And just as we were talking about the sophistication of pattern and of mind, the higher this thing goes, the greater it is established. Now, exactly what it means relative to that transcendent sphere, I'm not entirely sure. But I think at the very least, this image is starting to form, and I think it holds true until we can think of our a way out of it, or around it, or find something else that seems to be more correct, more true. But what can we say of this phenomena as we know it to be here on Earth? If we set something up, it is firm in its base. It means that in our world of time and space, it has a lasting quality to it. It may last beyond the life of a particular person. It may encompass a large piece, a large surface area of land, of the earth. But this is how it comes down to us, to this earthly existence. And so the first part of that verse, commit your works unto the Lord. And we do so because as we commit them to God, we're committing it to that intelligible sphere, to that ever after, to the world beyond the space and time. And if we are able to understand how to set something up such that it has a place there, then we know that it is something that will last here. And it will be beyond any individual's life. It will benefit the future generations. The Lord has made all things for himself. Yes, even the wicked for the day of evil. My initial thought is sort of a negative one. That is to say that throughout the proverbial book so far, that is, in the book of Job and the book of Psalms, in the book of Proverbs thus far, there is this continual pattern of the relationship to the self, not only to the world, but also to the transcendent. And the warning is for the self not to become inflated, for one's view not to be turned inward, to be captured in the prison of the self, to not pursue selfish desires, to place one's value in a properly ordered hierarchy, that this hierarchy is independent of himself. And that's not to say that the self is a bad thing and that it should be destroyed. That's not possible. Individuals must exist, but they exist given their proper context. And now the first thought that I had, I said it's negative. But it might not even land in this verse, but I think that in the similar vein as we are discussing about selfishness of the individual and the dangers therein, I think of this when I read the first verse. The Lord has made all things for himself. Yes, even the wicked for the day of evil. And who is to say that if this was not applied to man, that we would not consider this to be an evil thing, a thing that man should not engage himself in? So what can we say of this? How can we... I hesitate to say, how can we flip this, or how can we turn this into something that makes sense? But of course, we don't always want to reach for an interpretation that satisfies us or makes sense. We want to interpret things so that they are as they are meant, as they ought to be. And so I think the first thing that we must do is to examine the self of the transcendent, the self of the divine logos, or the principle of divine order, divine reason, the creative order. We are looking for some foundational piece that we can grab onto so that we don't get swept away by the tide into the sea. And so again, what of the Lord? The Lord has made all things for himself. What does that mean? How are we to conceptualize God and in the same sentence use himself? Well, at the very least, I think we could describe identity and agency to this divine logos. And just as I've said, we are looking for the fundament, that base support that holds up the identity. Now, if we examine the base support of identity in man, we could say that it is his soul. But what is his soul? Certainly it's beyond his essence. It is beyond his spirit. It is his principled being. We can say of a particular person that he or she changes from day to day, perhaps from moment to moment, from year to year, from decade to decade. And yet there must be a string of continuity that connects all of this. There must be something that identifies that individual in the moment, among the complexity of different things that make up that individual. The attentive mind must focus on something that can identify something that changes over time, for the thing that is changing to be a thing at all. And so we can say of this many things. We can bring up physical characteristics. But what of God? Perhaps we cannot use physical characteristics to identify this being, this force, this principled, creative source. Of course, we can fall back onto ourselves and identify within ourselves that thing which is seemingly unique among all life on earth. That is, the level of sophistication of our self-awareness and of our reason and of our, perhaps, ability to abstract. And it is not to say that we are special in totality. We are special among that matter and that substrate that by itself cannot intuit. It cannot make other matter intelligible to itself. We are unique in that way, separated from this other type of matter. There is that which is above us and that which is below us. The Lord has made all things for himself. And perhaps this is just the point. That is, it's through the act of creation that even the originating principle does not face the risk of falling back into itself, being absorbed constantly into itself, becoming smaller and smaller therein, if that is even possible. Even the wicked, for the day of evil. Many times there are questions posed by numerous people of why did God, if there is such a thing, create evil, if God is to be considered good. Perhaps it is just the necessary consequence of its existence. That is, if creation is going to be brought forth into some reality, then just like the sun casting its rays and illuminating the earth and everything in its vicinity, undoubtedly at some point there will be a shadow that is cast, for not everything can be immediately encompassed by this luminosity. And if we are to imagine this centralizing point, this divine logos, the ultimate authority, that is, everything beneath it serves its purpose. That what has been made for a reason. Even, as the verse says, the wicked for the day of evil. Everyone that is proud in heart is an abomination to the Lord. Though hand join in hand, he shall not be unpunished. To be proud is to have a feeling or deep pleasure of satisfaction because of something that an individual has done, their own achievements. And so what of pride? Why is this a negative thing? Well, I think on a principled level, when we talk about the self, when we talk about our relationship to the world that we find ourselves in and what we are able to achieve, I think we are often deceived by our own liberties. That is to say, the burden of liberation is quite heavy upon man. And what I mean by that is his will, I think, is often his entry into self-deception. That he has, and he is given, the possibility of finding satisfaction in his own existence. But what exactly does this mean? To find satisfaction in one's own existence. Moreover, from just one's own existence, it is his existence and what he chooses to do with his existence. That all of this, all of his achievements, are his own doing. And yet there is a denial. It's like as if one drives a car, they are prideful, and they are self-congratulatory about the fact that they have made the car that they are driving in, just because they own it, or they perceive that they own it, that they have some authority and some agency to use that vehicle. But of course they did not make it. And it is because they did not make that machine that they cannot be proud, or they cannot take credit for or accept credit for the production of that good or that material good. And if they were to do so, it would be deceptive. It would be wrong. It would be unbecoming of them. And I think in this way, although we have this will and this agency that belongs, in a sense, to us, it is connected to God, is connected to that divine logos. We are all sort of the fingers out of the branch-like projections from the divine eye, from the divine source. And because we are a part of this thing, if we try and separate ourselves from that thing and say that everything that we have done or that we are doing is because of us alone, in this instance we cut ourselves off from the communication of that divine source. We put a tourniquet, so to speak, on the vasculature of life and the intelligible sphere. Everything distal to that tourniquet eventually will die. And so is the way of the prideful person. Though hand join in hand, he shall not be unpunished. And I think that this has to do with the amount of individuals that succumb to a certain conscious parasite. A parasite that sucks meaning and purpose and diverts it away from the place that it ought to be directed. In these cultures and these societies, this hand-in-handedness that form because of their the interconnection between minds and between people. Just because we may form vast networks, just because this exists distal to that tourniquet that we talked about, doesn't save it from its eventual demise, given the fact that it is in that position, distal to that tourniquet, with a lack of oxygen. By mercy and truth iniquity is purged, and by the fear of the Lord men depart from evil. For what can we say of the remedy to wrongfulness? Certainly it is that of truthfulness. And of all of the possible categories that we can imagine, iniquity being one of these possible falsities, comprising immoral, grossly unfair behavior, wickedness, we find out the solution to our problems. We find out the correction to our wrongs, whether intentionally or unintentionally. And by grace we understand, or by grace and mercy we understand, that we do not at once know everything that is possible to be known. We are not gods. And by such a position in the world and in life, we will make mistakes. We will live under the thumb of iniquity at times. But by our discipline, by our discretion, by our discerning nature, and our commitment to that truth, we assure ourselves a path that is towards the purging of iniquity, the lifting of that thumb, the relieving of the burden of liberation from our shoulders. And by the fear of the Lord men depart from evil. We fear what is unknown, the potential for mistake, and the severe consequences therein. When a man's ways please the Lord, he maketh even his enemies to be at peace with him. When we satisfy that purpose that is external to the self, regardless of the rumblings and the conjecture of the heart, we provide this light and this illumination into the hearts of men that would otherwise wish to do us harm. And this undeniable path of purposefulness, I think, is the thing that flips that which is contrary to that which is parallel, to that which follows, to that which flows with. Better is a little with righteousness than great revenues without right. Now we've seen this verse before. We have an equivalency: better is little with righteousness, when compared to great revenues without right. When we say little in the first instance, we are saying little in terms of this having, which includes material prosperity. It is better with understanding the way to be. For in such a case, a man is at peace with himself and with his Maker. Although he may suffer from what little he has, perhaps that may leave him without food to a certain extent, without medical care to a certain extent. However, this righteousness in mind and in action, this alignment to that of the Holy Spirit, the conduit to that divine logos, that central point of intelligible reality, to be in line with such a thing brings man his purpose, not his great revenues. For with great revenues and without right, he cannot see, his heart cannot enjoy. It exists at the surface only. A man's heart deviseth his way, but the Lord directeth his steps. So what can we say of the difference between devising and directing? Of devise, we can think of something as a plan, something invented by the mind, a careful thought, a strategy, some conception of mind. Direction is external. It comes from without. It has a relationship with this conception of ours. The mind of man and its attentive abilities, its problem-solving abilities, its pattern recognition. It finds itself in its own environment. Rather, it finds itself in such an environment that it is able to perceive. There are many possible things that it can attend to, many paths by which it can converge on that divine logos. And this devising and this attentiveness is up to him. There's not just one way, not just one pathway by which he connects the dots. There are some by nature of life and its circumstances that take quite a windy path. Others that seem to follow what we call the straight and narrow, that there is little deviation from that path, and it's straight, direct, to the point. But we have to remember that the steps that we take along this path, although we can imagine the righteous one, when we take a step, the direction, ultimately, is by that divine source. It provides that gravitational pull of the heart and soul of man to it. And it is that creative energy that we can find within, that comes to us from without, is what guides us. It guides us home. It guides us to peace, to love, to prosperity of a certain kind. A divine sentence is in the lips of the king. His mouth transgresses, not in judgment. Now this is a strange verse. And I say it's a strange verse because at first glance the pull towards this, what I might say the postmodern antagonism, it unfortunately has a certain sway in my mind. It has a certain sway in all of our minds, and that is this pull towards the reduction, this breaking apart of something. Now, thankfully, this is not the only place that I go to, but since it is the first place, when I think of the divine sentence being in the lips of the king, perhaps I can say that there is a postmodern impulse, just as there is an impulse of a person born under the liberal tradition. And I think that, unfortunately, in our case, these two are wed together. That the promises of the liberal age at their foundation secured much for men, but did not solve how should I say, it did not solve certain problems that perhaps we believed that were solved. Or perhaps not. Perhaps I don't give enough credit to those who designed that of the liberal order. But certainly much has changed. It's difficult to keep up with all of the changes that take place after something fundamental has occurred. Now I'm speaking sort of in riddles here, but to those who are aware will follow what I'm saying. Now I say this to say that when I read divine sentences in the lips of the king, under the liberal antagonism, if I can say such a thing, divine sentence and lips of the king don't seem to go together. The king ought not to be a divine source. They should not have the authority of the divine. And under the liberal order, we have been liberated from the institution of hereditary succession. We have been liberated from, or at least we deceive ourselves from being under the thumb of monarchical control, under the control of the king. But I think what we see in the Bible, what we see in our lives, is not this promise of liberation, to liberate us from something that we cannot be liberated from. That is a natural way of human organization. At the top, there is this king. And perhaps I'm sort of at my infancy of understanding this and the way that this occurs, but I do believe this to be true. That is, we organize ourselves into hierarchical institutions. We do so willingly, or perhaps I should say explicitly or implicitly. We develop and we have a certain place in life, a certain status, whether it be economic, cultural, or otherwise. In our own relationships, we have our particular place. Within the items within our own home, we categorize them based on their importance. And despite our governing institutions considering themselves, at least the people consider the governing institution, and the governing institutions pride themselves on being that which is separated. They try and break up the powers that are offered to it, the state itself being a portion of human authority that is separated from the divine insight, from the divine direction. And it's not as though the divine intervention or direction has been nullified in the mind of man, certainly not. The hope is, and I think was, to secure the truthfulness of divine insight and direction. And we have much to lose and much to risk by having such a centralized form of governance and control, that every mind of man is capable of wielding such a responsibility and accept that role of being the conduit for the type of information that can revolutionize society. And to a degree, I think that is true. As played out in our markets, we have been immensely materially successful. Certainly part of which has been circumstantial, but nonetheless we are successful. A divine sentence is in the lips of the king. So that was my first impulse, my first thought. But the second, I think, is more appropriate. It is more fitting. It makes more sense. Not that the former doesn't make any sense. There is some sense to it. There is logic in it, but it is incomplete, perhaps. I think what this proverb is offering us is an image. An image of the world that was, an image of the world that comes to be. And that there is, among human affairs, at the top of the hill, the person that takes a certain type of responsibility. And this responsibility is bestowed upon him in part by circumstance. And if it is, I think, by circumstance, whether it be the will of the people or the numerous possibilities of organization, the numerous ways in which an individual can find themselves in a state of authority, perhaps not in the utopian sense, but just as a matter of living life, participating in all of its challenges. If we imagine this divine sentence coming from a man who is said to be a king, but a king in the modern sense we must imagine, because if we think just of the old, ancient sense of the king, we will lose any tie to truth that this proverb might offer. And so by king, I think we must think of responsibility and authority. I think we have to think of a certain place in this hierarchy of value. That if we were to give an analogy to some material situation, at home there are plenty of things in my room here, or perhaps in the kitchen, that I value above other things. My wallet being, and my keys being of fairly high importance on that material value. But in terms of, perhaps I should back up and I should consider, well, exactly what does it mean to place something higher than another in terms of its value? We could think of its utility. We could think of what it means. I think in the situation of the leadership of the kingship, I think meaning has a lot to do with this authority and the exercise therein. For my wallet and my car, these are material objects that allow me to, or material tools perhaps, that allow me to better participate and interact with the world and the society and the culture external to my own self. These material objects and the value that are attributed to them are an extension, a sort of an articulation, if we will. If my hand had more than 10 fingers, we could sort of presume that these objects, my wallet, and thereby the economic value, and what it allows me to do, and the car, the distance that it allows me to travel, and what it allows me to participate in, are like new fingers. They're extensions, new legs perhaps, legs for which I can take broader steps and move about this landscape. And it's for these reasons that they are valuable to me. But these things, unlike the position of the king, don't say anything about my place in this social hierarchy, or of the authority that I possess. It merely speaks of my potential, what I am able to do in the world. Of course, a car and a wallet are not the only things that I can consider, but they're sufficient for this analogy and explanation. I think if we think of that of a king, regardless of his extensions, regardless of his tools that he has, or the sword that he wields, his authority is a unique one among human beings. And I think the first part of this verse is attempting to illuminate that. A divine sentence is in the lips of the king. Now this is saying it whether we like it or not, that it's at the top of this hierarchy, if one is to accept such a position, then there is something about his place that parallels that of the divine nature. Now, of course, we must face the unfortunate question of alignment. And I say unfortunate for all of us because none of us can see full alignment. But I think that of positions that come in first contact with the divine light, or the light from the beyond, the person that is first exposed, I think, is the person at the top of that hierarchy, at the top of that pyramid, which can be seen as the king. And it's not just first, because we can just as easily say, well, if he's first, give it a couple minutes, and then the rays of the sun as it rises will reach the rest of us, and we will all be perfectly capable of interpreting and seeing. I think there's a part of that is true, that there is, in this liberal view, there is an inherent worth in all men. However, I think that there is something about position, there's something about responsibility and authority that requires a certain, perhaps require is not the right word, offers the opportunity of, or for, a certain type of seeing, a certain type of interpretation, a certain possibility of action. There's something to be said of human experience and participation in the world, and again of what it affords him. Let's think of a few examples. The situation of a medical doctor and the experiences that he or she has had, both in medical school and residency and outside of school. There are plenty of things, situations, time and discipline that have afforded this person with new insights that most people do not possess. They are, in their own way, upon this fractured hierarchy within their own realm of understanding, within that medical realm. They are near the top of that hierarchy. We can think of a mother or of a father. We could think of their engagement with the process of life, of establishing new life, and of securing that life and the safety of that child, the preparation of its future. There's something within that experience that the parent gains if they are attentive, just as if the physician is attentive to their studies and to what they have learned through their experiences, that will afford them new insights in life. Another example could be a CEO of a company. Much like a modern-day king, some of these CEOs, they sit atop a large apparatus. Their decisions have heavy implications. They cause downstream effects. And again, just like the parent, just like the physician, if they are attentive and they listen to the opportunity that they have been given, they can learn and they can see much more than individuals who are not in these positions. And the same applies to the king. If he is a good and attentive king, if he is one that is ordained, appointed, and aligned to the divine logos. And so by virtue of his position, he is afforded this divine sentence that is in his lips. And I think we can understandably see how the power that is wielded by one person can be too much to bear, especially if there is a fundamental misalignment between that decision, that sentence, and the actual will of the divine nature. His mouth transgresseth not in judgment. Now certainly this is a statement of an ought. Or perhaps it's not. It can be seen as an ought. That is to say, his mouth ought not transgress judgment. Transgress in judgment. We may be thinking of the ideal king here. For we are given his authority, and is followed up by his responsibility. Like a law. Then even if this king, this human person, chooses to break that law, he will be guilty. But his position is as such that his words, his articulations of meaningful information into the world, they shall not cross that which is set. They shall not cross this law that binds the meaningful experience of conscious beings on earth. Now exactly just what that is difficult to say. But at the very least, this reality, I think, unfolds itself to us in this way, regardless of if we have in the modern day a king or not. Regardless of if in the modern day we choose to call men of a particular status and authority a king or not. A just weight and balance are the Lord's. All the weights of the bag are his work. Now the first part of this verse we have seen before, I'm pretty sure verbatim in the Proverbs. A just weight and balance are the Lord's. Of course, what this implies is that the scales of justice, that sort of famous statue, it belongs to the divine. It exists rightly within that divine sphere. And I think by this, if we are to move ourselves back into the previous verse, we can see that if it belongs above, then the king and his gaze must be above to see it. It cannot be anywhere else. But what does it mean, all the weights of the bag are his work? We see that of a sort of commercial example, that if somebody, a merchant, let's say, of the ancient world, has with him a bag, a container in which it holds these weights, that allows him to weigh different things, equivalencies to one another. We see by this verse that the weights of the bag are his work. That is, the authority that belongs to this equivalency is to that of God, that of the supreme being. Which also means that if the king is to have his position, then he is the ultimate servant of God, for he has the ultimate responsibility of man. It is an abomination to kings to commit wickedness, for the throne is established by righteousness. Now this verse flows quite well with what we've been talking about. This is an explicit direction of the nature of the authority of the kingship. That is, if the king is to commit wickedness, to find himself concerned with affairs that are other than that which is highest, in the wicked sense that he's concerned with the desires of himself, that he cannot see beyond, then he is an abomination. He is this disgusting, decayed thing in the eyes of the way of things. And this soar in the landscape of the intelligible sphere will be identified, and it will be excised. Now, it doesn't save the downstream consequences of a tyrannical or despotic ruler. But I think that it does at least preserve in our hearts a sense of hope that this authority that he falsely exercises will eventually judge him, just as it judges every single one of us. For the throne is established by righteousness, by the highest of ethical principles. Righteous lips are the delight of kings, and they love him that speaketh right. Again, here I think we are seeing more of this alignment problem that is attributed to particular positions of authority in this hierarchy of man. I think that this "they" refers to as much as the class of the kings as it does to the people below him. For the kings must delight in this rightness of speech, so they can have a rightness in action. And the people must also delight in the rightness of the king's speech, so that they have confidence and faith in the direction of their society and the rules that they are placed under. The wrath of a king is as messengers of death, but a wise man will pacify it. Now we can imagine this quite illustratively. There is no shortage of kings in the ancient world that had a wrathful disposition. I think of Cambyses, the Persian ruler that conquered Egypt. And by Herodotus' accounts, he was insane to a certain degree. He was disturbed in his mind, wicked in his judgments. He was quite he was quite concerned with his appearance. He was quite vindictive with his punishments. He wasn't quite a discerning individual. He was ruthless. And his wrath certainly was, and sent out the messengers of death. The killing of one's son in front of a father due to, on the surface, sport, but on the interior, on the deeper aspect, insecurity. But a wise man will pacify it. Quite a difficult thing to pacify Cambyses' madness. But certainly there are echoes, I think, that we can see. There is the Anatolian king, Croesus. His land was conquered by the expansion of the Persian Empire. And he had a particularly interesting relationship with the king of Persia at that time, Cambyses' father, Cyrus. And his relationship was interesting because of his wittiness, because of his wisdom, I think we could say. It saved him from being executed by Cyrus. And it did more so than just save him from execution. It preserved him in his royal house. And this pacification of wrath is an interesting thing. For what can we say of a wrathful individual, one that is prone to the extremes of the heart? How does one understand how to quell such a flame? Now this Lydian king that I mentioned, Croesus, he had a particular way of cunning, we could say. The wisdom that he had certainly was there. It appealed to the ruler's sensibilities. When Cyrus was taking over Sardis, Croesus, upon viewing the destruction of his city, asked Cyrus something to the effect of, why do you destroy this city, and why do we sit and stand by and just watch it happen when they have already surrendered? Of course, Cyrus says something about establishing authority, making sure that the king knew who was in charge, but rather in more disrespectful words to that king, to the Lydian king. And then Croesus followed it up and he said, well, what you are destroying is no longer mine. It is yours. It is part of your empire. You have gained it for yourself. And it was by this quip that made Cyrus stop the destruction, the looting. And it's with that sort of interesting play, that play of words, that play of reason, that wittiness, that type of, it's a bit cunning. Now, of course, Chryseis is partial to his own people and his city, so he says it much more out of his own sake. And now I don't imply that the wise man says things out of his own sake, but in terms of the pacification of wrath, one must have a motive beneath that anger and that wrath of the person that they're trying to pacify, that cannot sort of be revealed all at once. Otherwise they might risk death themselves. The messengers of death of that king might find them. And so there's a subtlety and discerning nature to the wise person that considers the benefit both of the wrathful and of himself, of all who are involved. And I think that this, in the end, involves the right path, the righteous path. But it becomes a matter of this sort of a Rubik's Cube of, this twists and turns that one must expose themselves to when dealing with the wrathful authoritarian. And it's not until we properly align the colors together that we have solved that puzzle, and that death has been averted. Those messengers of death have been appeased. In the light of the king's countenance is life, and his favor is as a cloud of the latter rain. There's a certain sorrow that befalls me when I partake in reading Scripture. Not all of it, but some of it. And other texts of the type. And this sorrow is not due to the content, but it is because of the time that has passed and the change of culture, the change of convention. Now please let me apologize for I'm about to take a bit of a detour here, but buckle in. The point I will make, it will be a relatively small one, but it is something that I often feel. It's something that I often wonder about, if it is in fact true, or if I'm trying to find and reach farther than what is presented before me. Now certainly that would be a hubristic thing to say. The articulation between man and the Bible is that of a relationship between one living being and another. There is room for this ascent. There is room to pick that place on the base of the mountain for which we ascend. And we all may ascend at different places. But there is one peak to this mountain. I'd like to read a rather lengthy paragraph from the Histories of Herodotus to hammer home this point that I wish to make at present. Herodotus, on accounts of Wikipedia, lived from 484 to 425 BC. He was a Greek historian, and geographer from the Greek city of Halicarnassus, part of the Persian Empire. Now, this book I'm currently reading, currently in book 3, of which is called Thalia. And now he is discussing the rule of Cambyses. This is the Persian ruler. At the time, Persia was the dominant empire. The empire that invaded and conquered Egypt. And of course subdued many of Grecian descent, and the Greeks themselves. Now this Cambyses that we speak of, he ruled from 530 to 522 BC, well before the time of Herodotus. And so the paragraph begins. He then committed many such mad actions, both against the Persians and his allies, while he stayed at Memphis, both opening ancient sepulchres and examining the dead bodies. He also entered the temple of Vulcan and derided the image, for the image of Vulcan is very like the Phoenician Batisi, which the Phoenicians place at the prows of their triremes. For the benefit of anyone who has not seen them, I will describe them. It is a representation of a pygmy. He likewise entered the temple of the Cabiri, into which it is unlawful for anyone except the priests to enter. And these images he burned, after he had ridiculed them in various ways. These are also like that of Vulcan, and they say that they are the sons of this latter. It is then in every way clear to me that Cambyses was outrageously mad, otherwise he would not have attempted to deride things sacred and established customs. For if anyone should propose to all men to select the best institutions of all that exist, each, after considering them all, would choose their own. So certain is it that each thinks his own institutions by far the best. It is not, therefore, probable that any but a mad man would make such things the subject of ridicule. That all men of this mind, respecting their own institutions, may be inferred from many and various proofs, and among them by the following. Darius, having summoned some Greeks under his sway, who were present, asked them for what sum they would feed upon the dead bodies of their own parents. Now Darius the Great was another Persian ruler who ruled after Cambyses. Herodotus continues and he says, they answered that they would not do it for any sum. Darius, after having summoned some of the Indians called the Caladians, who were accustomed to eat their parents, asked them in the presence of the Greeks, and who were informed of what was said by an interpreter, for what sum they would consent to burn their fathers when they die. But they, making loud exclamations, begged he would speak words of good omen. Such, then, is the effect of custom, and Pindar appears to me to have said rightly, that custom is the king of all men. So what was the point of all that? Well, the point is that custom is the king of all men. It's a bizarre thing, the way that we find truth in life. The nature of our existence so bizarre Our story is man so wrought with questions that we have tried our best to answer. Custom is the king of all men. For in custom holds the way that we see the world. It holds how we value things. And something so egregious, even to the Greeks of the time, I say even, this is the experience of man, I shouldn't speak in such terms, but Herodotus leaves that example in there because it's a particularly outrageous example. Talking about a people that feast on their parents after death, making these exclamations and becoming beside themselves when someone suggests or asks the question if they would burn, for what sum of money would they burn their parents after death. And that was the thing that they found appalling. Not to the Greeks in that example that were asked the question, of course they wouldn't eat their parents. To them they found that appalling. But they thought nothing of burning their parents after death. We in the modern day burn our dead, some of our dead. We bury some others. And yet again it comes back to this custom, this convention. Not that our value and our meaning is arbitrary, but that where that meaning and that value comes down to us, where it settles, like the falling of a snowflake, that long path that it takes from up in the clouds down to the earth, all the possible ways that it could take. Its destiny chooses one. And I would like to relate another passage from this Herodotus' histories, from the words of Cambyses himself. He says, quote, "I am constrained to disclose to you a matter which above all others I desire to conceal. When I was in Egypt, I saw a vision in my sleep, which I wish I had never seen. I thought that a messenger arrived from my palace and announced to me that Smerdis, seated on the royal throne, touched the heavens with his head." Now this Smerdis was his brother, Cambyses' brother. "Fearing lest I should be deprived of my kingdom by my brother, I acted with more precipitation than wisdom. For in truth, it belongs not to human nature to avert what is destined to happen. But I foolishly sent Brisaspes to Susa to put Smerdis to death. Since that crime was perpetuated, I have lived in security, never considering whether, now that Smerdis was removed, some other mortal might not rise up against me. But, utterly mistaking what was about to happen, I became a fratricide to no purpose, and am nevertheless deprived of my kingdom. For Smerdis, the Magus, who was the person who the deity forewarned me in the vision would rise up against me, the deed then has been perpetuated by me. Consider, therefore, that Smerdis, son of Cyrus, is no more, but the Magi have possessed themselves of the throne. He, whom I left the steward of my palace, and his brother Smerdis." Now this was when Cambyses was in Egypt, conquering Egypt. The Magi were the priestly class of Persians, and the irony there is that Smerdis was one of the two that were left in charge of the palace while he was on his conquest, conquering Egypt. And he misinterpreted an oracle's declaration or vision. killing his brother before this event had occurred. And so now I bring this forward to say that, to hammer in the point, that destiny does have a certain way of reaching us. And it is not for man to decide. However, within the efforts of man, within all that he is, and the power and the strength of his will, let's assume for a moment in the goodness of his heart, this king, the custom above all men, and the destiny that man is forced to live under, I think at times can come into conflict, creating a bit of a confusion, a disillusionment. Now when I read this verse out of Proverbs chapter 16, verse 15, "In the light of the king's countenance is life, and his favor is as a cloud of the latter rain," I feel as though I am lost under the direction of the king of convention, the king of custom. I'm lost under his direction because I am a contemporary man, I'm a modern man. And just as those sirens disrupt my train of thought and pervert or disrupt anything that I have to say, I feel as though my interpretation is disrupted in this manner, that it has been lost in a convention of a different world. I have difficulty understanding, just as I have difficulty understanding what it would mean to devour one's parents after death, while at the same time being mortified at the thought of burning them. Now, it's not as cut and dry as this. This is not an embodied custom that I am faced with here. It is an interpretation. It is a symbolic landscape that I struggle with. And like an animal that may have a sense of a woman that is pregnant, and that may be by her side as that child grows and develops, it knows not what it means in the same way that a man knows what it means, or the father of that child knows what it means. And so at the very least we must start with humility, the beginning of any path, especially that of interpretation. For I know that this verse is pregnant with meaning, but I worry that I don't understand the depth that it can offer me. And there have been many times throughout this podcast that I've tried to reorient my mind so that I may find myself in a better position to approach that which is pregnant, so that I may better be able to receive that which is stated, that I may be able to retain that which is relevant, that which is salient. This is something that is integrated into this practice. In the light of the king's countenance is life, and his favor is as a cloud of the latter rain. So let's begin our journey. In the light, what can we say of it? I've often thought of the light as something that is of our conscious perception, something that is intelligible. For when light floods into a room, we are able to see the contents of that room. I think of, at this moment, I sit in the darkness that is illuminated by two things: my dimly lit computer screen and this small LED light that comes up and snakes over the Bible to illuminate it. And yet, apart from this small luminosity within this room, everything at the periphery is a bit dark. Difficult to see beyond a certain point if I were to turn my head. My window shades are open. There are street lamps that are on. It is nighttime. Across the street there is a commercial strip. This business is still open. There are people there. And yet at the nighttime, in the absence of the profound illumination of the sun, my eyes are drawn to that which I can see. For why would I fixate on the darkness? If I were to fixate there, it would be some abstract thought about what it means to be looking and peering into the darkness. But as a matter of natural consequence, without having much desire to think in an abstract way, at that moment my eyes are just drawn to what is immediately perceivable. And so let's imagine this expression of the king. He's displaying some emotion to us. It is nighttime. Perhaps he is just as this business is across the street, and a few other areas are illuminated. His countenance is illuminated. Now I think what we see here is directionality. We see positive expression. For life is a good thing in this context. And the light of the king's countenance is life. That we are seeing of his expression something that is positive, but it's much more than just positivity. It is life. It is the animating spirit. It is the separation between the inanimate and the animate. It is that which contains within it the capacity for growth, reproduction, death. It contains within it this cycle. And the light of the king's countenance is life. The king, of course, we have spoken of his place, assuming that he is duly elected. Not necessarily by the will of the people, but by this destiny that falls to the earth. As the snowflake falls to the earth, and it lands where it may land. And so perhaps, in a certain sense, this may not be in a positive direction. Not in a negative one either. But just something that is to be seen. That it is through his expression, this king, and his position in the hierarchy, his social standing, his power, his ability to enact change to the human condition. The light, and therefore I would say it is a degree of goodness, but light can also be shown for the realization and the conceptualization of evil, so certainly we cannot find ourselves in a good territory in that context. But again, this expression of his, when it is made known and it is made to flood over his kingdom, I believe that we begin to see the spinning of that wheel, that cyclical wheel of life, that birth, the process of living and of experience, and the process of death, process of dying. And it is not he that is the cause of life, but it is he that gives a face and that gives an expression to it. Because it is, again, as I've said, his expression that floods over his people. And as foreign as it may seem to us today in our customs of the liberated individual, the manner of this king, I think, is embodied in many. And just because we live under the liberal thumb, that what we value is that which is of the individual and of his own ability. Regardless of this, we will find ourselves a king in life. And I think it was the designs of the founders that we orient ourselves towards the peak of that mountain. The peak of the mountain, of course, that is something that is higher than any man. And that we all should wish to ascend that mountain and reach that peak. We, of course, as man, as human beings, who knows how high we will get in that ascent. But the higher we get, the closer we are to that luminosity, the expression of righteousness, the righteous countenance of life. And just as they, as we do now, experience this, that we must remember the very process by which we make known our thoughts and the way that we perceive the world, and that if we do so to the highest degree and encapsulate that position of that king, let's say, we enrich this experience that is life. The cycle is something that extends beyond the selfish possessions of one man. It extends to the life of man as a whole. Now the second half of this verse, and his favor is as a cloud of the latter rain. Now this is where I may get lost, if I haven't gotten lost already. His favor is as a cloud. Now what language could we use to describe this? What might that mean? A cloud is something that may obscure, but it is also something that is a congregation of molecules that becomes something that is visible in the sky. two, I think, very different meanings. But perhaps not. Because in either instance, whether it's a covering or if it's a congregation, a consolidation of something that was at once separated but now has been coming to a centralized point, again, something that is visible, something that was in existence before but now has a perceivable condition in the mind of man. I think both of these, now considering that we're talking about the king, that holds such a heavy responsibility and authority, and since we are talking about the context of his favor, both the covering and the coming to a central point and the perceivability of this favor I think both serve a purpose, a common purpose. Now, of the latter rain, I think we are describing here an agricultural example. The latter rain being perhaps at the end of something, at the end of a particular period. Now this cloud and this covering, in conjunction with this rain, it means that it is pregnant with something that can provide. And since we are remembering, in the first instance, in the light of the king's countenance of life, is life, and in our illustration we have thought of this expression on the king's face, and this expression is more than just a smile, a frown, whatever. In the positive sense, since we are speaking of favor, we are thinking of the cycle of life. We are thinking about the experience of man. We are thinking about his being, his worth, being sort of caught up in this relationship that he has to the king, and how important the king's understanding, wisdom, perception is to the functioning of the rest of that society, that culture, the integration of custom. Of course, the king's mind is not everything. The individuals in the ancient world had their sovereignty. There was a spirit of liberty. The spirit of liberty is quite an old one. It's not particular to the American context. And given that my mind is thinking about the Persian Empire, I'm thinking about King Cyrus, I'm thinking about King Cambyses, I'm thinking about King Darius, and I'm thinking about their subjects, and I'm thinking about the customs of Egypt, I'm thinking about the customs of Persia, thinking about the customs of India and of Greece. Regardless of this complexity, man still is much influenced by the ruler, by the king. And I think that this favor and this pregnant covering, perhaps covering in a sense of security, covering in a sense of something that is explicit, that is made known, that has an illuminating effect, that at the end of something we have the pregnant cloud that is full of rain to enrich the soil. It could be at the end of a period of famine. It could be at the end of a period of growth. It could be at any point at the time in this cycle. If favor is to be in the mind of the king, we will have this pregnant nature, this pregnant cloud, that will bring abundance. Now, this agricultural example is our example of abundance here, but it certainly transcends just that experience, because certainly the ancient world was much more on the edge of starvation than the modern day, but the principle of importance and the value therein is not lost. Though on the surface it's quite difficult to see without proper orientation, which is why I perhaps wasted is not the right word, spent that time in the beginning talking about the words of Herodotus. And so what now? We have a bunch of words, we have a particular direction of my interpretation. How can we bring this back home? Bring it down to something that is meaningful to the modern man. Among the possibilities, the ways in which we can see life, the way in which we can see our circumstances, I think that if we are to be of a particular disposition, if the modern man accepts the weight of his burdens and understands the authority that he has in his life, I speak of the liberated man, exactly what he is liberated from, we could say many things. But the fact is that the point that I now wish to make is that he has almost, not entirely, but almost the responsibility of a king. And he has before him the possibility of his kingdom and the flourishing of his life. And so that regardless of the circumstance, the blessing of authority can be exercised through wisdom, or it can be seen as perhaps the chains of slavery, above which the thumb of the tyrant is constantly pushing down. And for this favor to be accepted, I think it requires work, it requires wisdom. It requires perceptibility. At the outset, we started with humility. I think it both starts and ends with this humility. For we have to be able to be open to see, and when we have seen, we have to remain open so that we don't miss, or so that we don't make a mistake. We have to be discerning. We have to take into account what is required in every case for approbation from the heavenly, from the King of Kings. And if it is to be so, we will receive this pregnant cloud that within it has not necessarily that which we desire, but it has that sustainability of life. And for us in the modern day, is beyond mere subsistence, but much more in the spiritual domain, assuming that we have at least some time in our day to take and reflect. And perhaps build something that is deep within our minds that would otherwise be impossible. if we did not learn to understand the authority that rules over us. Alright, I've gone on long enough about that verse. Verse 16. How much better is it to get wisdom than gold, and to get understanding rather to be chosen than silver? So this verse is a statement of value. This is not something new. We have seen verses like this before. It is also a verse of exclamation. There is a sense of joyousness in the way that it is written in the context. Certainly, gold and silver can be seen as money. Money is a medium of exchange. It's a unit of account. It's a store of value. From these definitions and uses of money, I think we can think of it, we can conceptualize of it, something as a tool. Now the wise man uses tools for his own purposes. If he has no tools, he creates them. If money is the unit of exchange through which his efforts in life and the value that he has created in society must be converted into, his understanding and his wisdom should bring him to the path that is sustainable. For it is not that man desires the material substrate of this money. Such a thing would be considered base, superficial. But again, the understanding behind, the understanding of how to create that value, what seed one must plant in order for that tree to grow, that tree of value that can be then converted into that unit of exchange that allows for this action in society. Now, of course, that explanation in and of itself is insufficient, I think, to satisfy man in his being. For he himself is an individual agent. He has a worth. He is a part of various different identities, perhaps we could say. That of the local community, that of the family, that of the nation, that of the corporate body. And his existence is not just merely transactional in this value sense. Now perhaps there's a way that we could wiggle our way into saying that it is merely transactional in a value sense. But it is not transactional in the value sense if all we are to say is that his efforts are to find an adequate exchange or find an adequate transition for his utility into that medium of exchange. He is more than this watered down thing. He has a soul. He has the capacity for divine insight. And I think that this wisdom, this undulating, circulating potential that is wrapped up within the mind of all of us is a thing that we ought to be concerned with. And on the surface, it seems as though this thought is selfish. it is, I think, to some degree, a focus on the self, and I think that although we are incessantly warned about the dangers of self-inflation and self-imprisonment, it is not the case that the self is something that does not exist or ought not to exist. It is certainly something that exists. And it behooves the righteous to understand the place that the self must hold in order for him to obtain wisdom, in order for him to achieve understanding. Now it is within this dance and this interplay of his potential and the relationship to the outside world and all of the tools that are laid out before him, albeit tools that have been developed by man, but that's okay, we are men, we ought to use our tools. Again, these tools ought not to be the thing that builds that selfish prison. We use tools in order to maximize, to make more efficient. Now, what exactly are we maximizing or making more efficient? Well, it must be our capacity for understanding and alignment for God. If we are to choose in life to use a hammer as a carpenter, we ought to build a house that is appropriate, that is, it has beauty built into it, it's going to serve the purpose of housing a family. It ought to facilitate the ends that every family ought to seek after. Close, loving relationships, the development of new life, in the direction, and again in that alignment towards that divine logos, the peak of that mountain. We as human beings, we are born and we die. In each cycle, each generation that passes, we have an attempt, we have an opportunity to ascend this mountain, to ascend this staircase. So certainly it must be wisdom and understanding before gold and silver. For what would we do with gold or silver without understanding or wisdom? The highway of the upright is to depart from evil. He that keeps his way preserves his soul. Now of the upright, I think we can attribute certain synonyms. The righteous, the ethical, the moral, the proper, the reputable, the principled, the honorable, the honest. What's most interesting about this verse is the idea of keeping of a way and how that is related to the preservation of the soul. That would seem to suggest if that the way is not kept, then the soul is not preserved. And so what does it mean to keep the way? Well, if we are to imagine the first part of that verse in sort of a narrow-minded, earthly example, I think of this busy street right outside of my window, that perhaps the faint sound of cars passing perhaps is audible through this microphone. Certainly, when one of those loud cars passes, it's inescapable. And so I imagine this road. I imagine that this road can be thought of as the road of the upright. And they are constantly departing and fleeing evil. They are fleeing the contrary nature. They are fleeing the destructive nature, the self-destructive nature. They are fleeing the parasitic. They're moving out in a way so they can build something, so they can preserve something. They can preserve something that they have kept with them, an understanding that they have built over time. They're taking with them the things that they value most. The things that they have valued most, that they value most, has been shaped by convention. Again, I think of Herodotus here. They've been shaped by their tradition, by their families, by their loves. By their practices, by their discipline, by their principles. And so if we draw a line, a boundary around these things, these important things that they put into their luggage they take with them in their cars as they depart from evil, all of these things are stored within the luggage of the soul, we can say. And that of the upright, their attempt in this experience of life, however short it might be, is to continually expand that soul so that they can place more things into it, more problems that they've encountered, more solutions that seem right, more experiences that have taught them lessons. And of course, as I mentioned, the principles, that of the honest, that of the humble, that of the receptive. For without that reception, nothing would be perceivable, nothing would be learned, nothing would be remembered. There's a lot of talk in the modern day United States. We're currently going through somewhat of a revolution. Certainly it's not a violent revolution. Hopefully it doesn't come to that point, but we are at the peak of something. Maybe a crossroads is a better way to put it. And we've embarked on a path. This path is continually unfolding. I think the path of life is not as cut and dry as a fork in the road. For our will has a lot to do with this. The steps that we take are fragile. That we may stumble on the path, but through our learning, through our understanding, our attentiveness, we can correct our mistakes and illuminate, perhaps illustrate, the path that seems best to us to move into. And I think revolutionary periods have a lot of this creative drive and spirit to them. Now I bring this up because the superficial political discussions are always around the Republicans and the Democrats. There's a lot of strange psychological battling that is going on in the country. A cultural war, I guess we can call it. A cultural civil war. And the matter of conservation and of liberation is the ground upon which we fight. The questions of what are we conserving, what ought to be conserved, and the questions of what are we liberated from and what ought we be liberated from. Now there's a bit of irony here the matter of opposites is, I think, at once comical but also maddening. For we live in a bit of a tribal moment. I think that is something that characterizes this revolutionary era. That in our warfare is primarily abstract, spiritual, psychological. But what of these opposites? What of this irony? I say conservative. In a certain context, it is a camp that people belong to, a political camp, a side in this sort of spiritual, cultural war. When I say liberal, it is on the opposite side, the opposing side, a different tribe with very firm boundaries. But the words in and of themselves ought not to have those boundaries around them. And yet I come to the question, well, should conservatism and liberalism not have boundaries around them? And the answer is of course not. And so it's a matter of what type of boundaries surround that which is identified, or that which is given identity. And I think that when it is the case that when something is given an identity that ought not to be given an identity, or that the boundary that identifies something is false, it creates conflict. Creates conflict in man, creates conflict in, I would imagine, in nature. So what does this mean? I must have an example in mind. Well, surely there are plenty here. If we thought of conservative and that of liberal. These two things are principles. As I mentioned at the outset, every person has things within their life that they choose, or perhaps that they don't choose, but perhaps are liberated from. There are many things in the ancient world, in the ancient form of government, that we are liberated from, hereditary succession being one of those. Tyranny perhaps could be another, though that can be, I think, brought into question these days. Revolutions, I think, also bring potential, this creative potential, but also the potential for parasitism, for influence. The creative mind is naive, receptive to a fault. How can we say it, the downside of the liberal nature But again, I return to this irony. When I say liberal, people may jump to something that is liberal in a sense, but what they choose to identify it with is not necessarily the principle, but the pattern of organization, again, convention, custom, that is being wrought around these populations of people and what they believe. And I think when we move away from principled thinking, we tend to find ourselves in muddy water, dangerous water, water in general. Water, of course, being a symbol of chaos, of uncertainty, instability. It brings change. It can bring destruction, but also it could bring something new. It can clean the ground before it, wash away that which was having a polluting effect. among our liberals we have extremes, among our conservatives we have our extremes. But of course this would exist even if we talked about the principle. But it's a matter of discussing the principle in a discerning manner. For if we are to take a principle of foundation out of a steel or iron beam that supports a house, the place that it is put to matters. And it requires the diligence, the discernment, the understanding of the builders to know where to place that support so that it may hold the house. Now the builder may put it at an extreme. This extreme may be at the extreme of the point that it could tolerate a particular load, or the extreme that it may not take upon itself the burden of the home and actually be able to hold it up. These would be the extremes of that principle, perhaps. But when we are considering the alignment of that principle, moving it into a position that is most accepting of that burden, that is the safest place for it, that it will last the longest, then I think we find a true principle. And in a true principle, we find something worth conserving. In the process of discovering that which is worth conserving, we have liberated ourselves from certain possibilities. We have liberated ourselves from certain mistakes, certain burdens that ought not to be borne, given following the right principles, the right conservative principles. And as we go through this process, we can see that the two necessarily need each other. That we must find, we must question, we must be open to questioning existing principles, and perhaps there are better ways to do things, while at the same time not sacrificing the fundament, not letting the house crumble, not letting the institutions fail. He that keeps his way preserves his soul. He that keeps his principles preserves his country. Pride goes before destruction, and an haughty spirit before the fall. Now this is a perfect verse to transition into, because I think it speaks to the problem that I spoke of, just not in as concise of language. So how does this relate? Pride goes before destruction. Well, just as we have done many times before, we're going to have to define pride. Let's think of this pride, just for the moment, as a principle of selfishness, There's more that I want to say here. For if we are prideful, there is this intense pleasure, this joy, this gratification, fulfillment at our own achievements. It's an inward focus, which perhaps in moderate doses is okay. Like I said, there is an individual, there is a self. It has the place for it to be acknowledged as such. But the misplacement of this deep pleasure, I think, can be unholy. For this deep pleasure and satisfaction ought to be offered up. It should be sacrificed. For if we sacrifice that up, what we gain in return is much more fulfilling than what we can find when looking in the mirror. So what is this pride before destruction? How does it relate to this preservation and liberation of the soul, of the country? I think what we are seeing here is the existence, or the attempted existence, of something by itself, for itself, in itself. And for some reason, it is unable to do so in this reality, in this life. And I think that that attempt is the pride, and the destruction is the result of that. And I think, sort of as an analogy, is any sort of infarct, right? So a stroke, a heart attack, the result of a pulmonary embolism. I think of perhaps it's not 100% of a good analogy, but I think it gets us somewhere, that everything distal to that insult is going to die. It is deprived of the oxygen that's necessary to keep the cells alive. And I think in a like manner, the prideful man, as he turns on that vacuous pressure into the confines of the self, that part of him, violently turns back to the opening that allows him to communicate with the world, and he thereby becomes this embolism, and he blocks this arterial vessel, causing that destruction, for no oxygen can get in, and what results is the destruction of that identity. The identity that is he himself. And so, of course, when we are thinking about this experience, this vacuous instance, let's say, in which we have the opportunity to turn off that pressure and just turn around and look outward, look upward, let's say, or to, as the previous verse says, depart from evil, enter onto that highway. Not to look into the self, not to deny the self. Or I should say, not to look into the self, and also not to deny the self. To remember it, for we are the self, and we participate and we act in a world of things and of structure, and we are intimately related to that structure. And so again, as we reimagine this illustration, the moment of that vacuous pressure pulling us inward, let's bring into the fore the two principles, the conservative and the liberal. What do they do in this space, in this instance? I think we can also imagine the illustration in which this vacuous occurrence is not occurring, that pride perhaps is put aside for a moment, and we're not all that worried about the potential downsides, we can also imagine that and how the principles of conservatism and liberalism exist there as supports, as principled supports. But again, we must consider we are talking about verse 18. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before the fall. So what do these principles do? And let's not think of the conservatism and the liberalism as the tribal conservatism and liberalism, as the customary, the gradually inflating customary definitions that are emerging, but rather, again, the principle of true conservation of things that ought to be conserved, and the true surrendering and of true liberation of that which ought to be freed of. I think in order to prevent us from becoming this embolism that blocks the only articulation that the self has with the external world, is to either increase the permeability of the identity of the self, or it is to prevent that vacuous pressure, to turn it off somehow, to use the principles as supports. So while that vacuous pressure may be turned on, we're not going anywhere because we have strong supports. And I think in this way we can see a few different ways of being. Exactly what of this pressure and its sort. I'm not really too sure at this moment, but for the moment we are sticking with this analogy so that we can come to some sort of conclusion. When we think of liberation, we ought to be thinking of the act of setting someone free from imprisonment, of some slavery or oppression, some release or deliverance. We can think of salvation. I think for a moment it is useful, it is perhaps pertinent to talk about the source of this vacuous pressure that pulls us into the self. I think there are many sources of it, but of the ones that I could think of off the top of my head, I think of trauma. I think trauma has an unfortunate particular way about it that prompts us to recoil into the confines of the self. And I think the effects are, unfortunately, quite the same as the prideful person. The prideful person being overly satisfied at their own achievements, selfish and vain. Vanity comes to mind. Looking in that mirror of the self. In the more superficial sense, I think of vanity as somebody who's actually attracted to themselves. They find themselves pleasing to look at. They might be partial to the way that their body looks or their physical features. They might be satisfied in the sense that they feel themselves morally superior at the achievements in their life. I think this is a form of pride that is the cause of this vacuousness into the self. I think a position of power can be the cause of this pride, of inflating oneself beyond any position that one man ought to occupy relative to perhaps another or relative to God. And so these are but a few, and I'm sure that there are many more, of the sources of this vacuous pressure into the self. So what can we say that is destroyed? We've talked of pride. We've talked of an analogy to that of a cardiovascular event in which everything distal to a blockage in a vessel causes death, causes that destruction. So is it the case that the self is the thing that is destroyed, or is it something else? Well, I think, at least in part, it is the self. At the very least, it is the destruction of possibility. It is the end of a certain type of ability to transform and to transcend oneself. It places limits on that sort of experience. I think to an extreme, as one truly begins to turn inward and only satisfy those selfish desires, what is destroyed is their relationship to the world. Perhaps the way that they experience life in the world. It becomes small, lonely. That landscape becomes desolate. For once full of possibility in life, after pride, it becomes arid and barren. And I would have to imagine this sort of thing is a destruction of sorts. And a haughty spirit before a fall. Now here I think of the beginning, I think of Genesis. I think of the formation of this intelligible sphere, again in the divine realm, that man's mind has reached a level of sophistication and has been touched by that divine entity. And now that substrate of creation and organic matter is able to perceive and intuit now, of course, his understanding and his freedom of will is not without consequences or potential dangers. We have eaten from this tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And I think that this verse here, the haughty spirit before a fall, I think it suggests, certainly it's an echo of that prime experience, of that perennial pattern that man faces. He is always subject to his choices. There is always dangers with how can I say, the knowledge that he gathers for himself. And as we consider the ladder, as we've been discussing, the ladder from the more earthly realm, and every step sort of represents this transcendence to some higher level of sophistication, of understanding, closer to that realm, the heavenly realm. As we ascend, we increase our understanding, but it's not just increasing understanding, it's increasing wisdom, it's increasing one's piety. We are much enriched in the ethical landscape as we ascend these stairs. But again, at every step we face temptation, We face insecurities. We face, as in this example, certainly a form of temptation, that of believing and taking our eyes off of that which ought to guide us. Now this haughtiness, it's an arrogance, a false conception of superiority. It's conceit, snobbishness. And through this perversion of attention, there is nowhere to go but down, back down those steps from which we came. Because we look down, we look at ourselves, we look anywhere except up, where we ought to be looking. And of course there is a descent, there is a movement back down through those transformational phases to some more primitive state of understanding and primitive state of being. Better it is to be of a humble spirit with the lowly than to divide the spoil with the proud. Okay, so it's time for, I think, a little bit of a pause here. This marks a new day. Every once in a while in these episodes, I'll pause and make a reflection of some sort. A reflection that orients me to get back into the Proverbs or whatever it is that I'm doing. And it's funny to begin this reflection, how many things of intention begin with a feeling of desire. Or perhaps I should say there is a desire of will that is present. That it is like a man that is standing beneath a lamp post, a street lamp. Perhaps he is silhouetted by this position that he finds himself in, illuminated to a degree. Maybe his back is turned to whoever happens to see him. Around him is the darkness of the night. The liminal space he occupies, it is largely a metaphorical landscape. And it is not that this man beneath the street lamp is up to no good or wishes harm. But he is there and he is waiting. He's waiting for something. He's waiting for a word. He's waiting for something to guide him. But I think as we take time to sit in that space, that intentional sphere, and we consciously eliminate that which causes us distraction, that would otherwise wish us to think of things other than this liminal space, for the mind to go to something that is easy. Think about going to sleep. Think about the next meal that we are going to have. Think about something that one could find on the internet to occupy their time. This liminality really is a good word to describe it. It is to be at the threshold of something, to willfully place yourself at that threshold. And how exciting is it to be at the beginning of a journey, or at the door to the highly sought after answer to one's problems. And as we stand at the entrance of this transition in this liminal space, perhaps one foot in one realm and another foot in another, we are filled with this excitement of heart, that is not similar, I would say, to the excitement of general excitement, perhaps we can say. This excitement is deep, it is sobering, it is controlled. It is aware, it is attentive. It is ready to act, as someone on a threshold should be. And so the threshold that I would like to introduce, the liminal space that I would like us to occupy, is encapsulated in the word better. Better is often this in-between place. Again, it is a luminal space between the light and the darkness, between the greater and the lesser, the larger and the smaller, the warmer and the colder. Better, this word, is often used in a comparison. We have something here, we have something there. Some of this something is better than some of that something. Now, before we really dive into that, I sort of want to bring in perhaps an inconsequential point. And if it is indeed to be inconsequential, then we will get our foolishness out of the way now before we enter into that space, which we shall consider to be sacred. Verse 19, it begins by saying, "Better is to be of a humble spirit with the lowly than to divide the spoil with the proud." Now, in modern parlance, we don't usually start a sentence with better when we are comparing things. We say that chocolate is better than potato chips. We say that this job is better than that job. Now, perhaps in the sense of grammar, we may be making an error. But I'm thinking of a number of things, perhaps, that are beginning to coincide with one another. I think of Herodotus' quotation when he says that custom is the king of all men. I think of Cratylus when we are talking about the etymology of words. These two sentences, both by Herodotus and the dialogue by Plato, point to the difficulty with speech. They point to the difficulty in speech because truth is a difficult matter. Now, something that is seemingly benign, I think to many ought not to be made any sort of deal of. But to those who are either unfortunate of a poetic spirit, and I say unfortunate because they're always trying to find some meaning to satiate their lack therein or thereof. But nevertheless, when I see better, it is. I think that this distinction between at least the way I use the comparison and the word better in a sentence and the way that it is used here, recognizing that this is a translation from the original, so who knows exactly what kind of pattern I'm drawing out of this, but I'm considering something sort of a mathematical equivalence. Certainly this would exist between both uses of the word better, at least in a sort of geographical sense in the sentence, locational sense. But to begin a sentence by saying better it is to be humble of spirit with the lowly than to divide the spoil with the proud. I think we are instantly brought into that liminal space, rather than brought into perhaps the desire of the writer. Now, why do I say that? Perhaps if we are thinking of more of a selfish objective, we would begin by stating the object of our desire. We would begin that sentence by stating the object of our desire, or some object that we wish to, at some point later in the sentence, indicate something that is higher than that object. But to begin by saying better, we have thrown ourselves not within the object, but within the space, on the verge, at that initial stage, at the threshold, at the boundary. We have yet to know, granted it is but for an instance, we have yet to know what lies on either side of this boundary. And just as the time that I took to explain this liminal sense, the feeling that I have, the man underneath the lamppost, perhaps he that stands between the intelligible and unintelligible sphere, the man that is of wanting, the man that is strong of will, the man that is attentive, that will stand there and focus until that liminal sphere has allowed him to make an advancement, to unlock the door that is before him. So let's make that advancement. But let's not get distracted by the whole. Now, there is certain utility in thinking of things as the whole, but let us walk as man walks through life, starting from the beginning to the end. Now, we walk so fast sometimes that we forget to pay attention to even the most subtle things in our experience. But I think it is within subtlety that provides us with enrichment. Man's existence can be seen as a plain existence. Even those who live quite active lives, I think, can live their lives in this state of activity, travel the world, and yet be satisfied to some degree, dissatisfied to another. And yet, I think to a discerning person, depending on the degree, can take very little information and do a lot with it. Now, on one hand, I would like to imply that as opposed to the person who travels the world and lives through many experiences, that this is certainly a positive thing. A life well lived is a life that is perhaps satisfying to reflect on, but by the same token, the man who skips through life and through his experiences misses out on much of that subtlety, much of that beauty. And so we find ourselves in this better it is territory. We find ourselves in that comparison at the threshold. It is the point at which we can find the discerning, we can find the truth. It is the point at which something comes into effect. It is this magnitude or intensity. In order for some process to occur, better it is to be. Now, what can we make of this type of comparison? Better it is to be. What does it mean to be? Such a simple question, but such a difficult answer, it would seem. One of these things that I think is so easy to pass by, And I don't blame anybody who passes it by. We have to pass by many things in life. Otherwise we'd be inundated by so much information that we wouldn't be able to get anywhere or do anything. Certain downsides, certainly, to that mind which chooses to analyze and to interpret everything that they come across. But again, we find ourselves between two things at the threshold within the liminal space. For what does it mean to be but to exist? Perhaps for something to take place, to happen, to occur. Even these sorts of things are difficult once the mind focuses on them for very long. What can we say of occurrences? My speaking is such an occurrence. What does it mean for this to happen? Well, it is something to be known, but even in that definition of occurrence, I'm using be, I'm falling into this circular type of reasoning. What does it mean to exist? To live, to be alive, again, to be, to have objective reality, whatever that means. It seems beyond man, if we are to think in this manner, what some might call objective. There's only so far that we can go, for we cannot separate the mind from the body. We cannot separate ourselves from our own experience. We can do a lot to understand the world that is outside of what we can directly experience. But ultimately, we are beings that experience. We are things that are able to understand experience, to intuit experience. And there's a certain part of me that doesn't understand a reality in which there is no mind to understand reality, or to think, and to see. And that mind must necessarily extend beyond the human mind. Now, why do I say that? Better it is to be of a humble spirit with the lowly. What kind of a statement is that? How can that statement be made? Certainly the statement could be false. But I suppose it would be quite difficult to make the assertion that even if this statement was false, if we found some true comparison and equivalency, and we assumed, or that we went on believing that it was true, for it actually was true, and we could say by extension, for the sake of argument, that this statement in this verse is true. How can that be? Set aside our own being, how can it be that something is better than something else? By what standard? By what mind? By what conception? If we say that something is better, we are, to a certain degree, by extension, saying that something is superior. We are moving upwards in this direction. But how far can we go? How high is it possible to go with this betterness in being? I think it is one thing to be able to see, as one sees from above, as they may see out of an airplane. But it is another thing to experience that reality, the observer versus the participant. Now, I don't mean to make an equivalency here, that's not the point. But certainly there is a difference between what I do here, talking about being, and actually being of being in life. Ideally, there is a transmission, there is a relationship between the two. If it is realized, certainly it must be somewhat easier to put into practice. If something is seen, then it could be perceived, perhaps understood to a certain degree. It may not be incorporated into one's life, but if it is seen, it is known at the very least. Or perhaps not. Perhaps it takes the discerning individual. Perhaps that is why, when we begin with humility, the discernment is that necessary filter. We must both choose the types of and the amount of information that come in, but also when the information that we do choose to allow in, that information is put through a secondary layer of filters, of understanding exactly what it is that information means. But that is the key, this understanding of meaning, of being, of direction, of purpose. Better is to be of a humble spirit with the lowly. Humility, the antidote to pride. What does it mean to have a humble spirit? The spirit, this sort of essence that I have described in previous episodes as the smoke from a fire. The fire itself has an identity, it has a location, it has an existence of a certain sort, it has certain characteristics. But there are things about it, from man's point of view, that we can perceive of. The smoke from that fire, we could smell it and yet not be exposed to other elements of its character, that of its heat, that of its color, that of its noise, that of its sound, or even that of its location, its physical place, or of what it feeds on. And this essence is much like the smoke. The spirit of the fire is that smoke, which can be seen, it can be smelled, but it is but a piece of its character, of its nature. And so this humility, much like the fire, the smoke that comes from the fire, this humility of a man, of a person, is an essence that follows him. Perhaps it is something that could be seen in his wake when he is not present, through the interaction of others, or through his behavior. Such things, I think, give me pause to appreciate the complexity of human behavior, and of the things that we can understand and know about somebody even if they are not in our presence, even if we don't know anything about them. We can pick up on bits and pieces of one's behavior based on the trail, the breadcrumbs that they had left behind. And again, in such a way, this is the smoke, this is the essence of that person. But we can go further. It's not just that. It is even in the presence of the person, the physical person, just like the fire, the human being is complex, more so than the fire. I'm always struck by the depth of the human being, and that it's very difficult, it's possible, if one is good at doing it, to uncover that liminality of somebody's being in conversation, to discover that threshold and that that will, that desire to be, to move, and to become. That is a depth of soul. But the spirit is something that most people perceive at the outset, perhaps the first meeting of somebody. We can get a false perception, no doubt, but there is, I think, a distinct characteristic of meeting a person that is akin to the smoke from the fire. And that is to say that this initial encounter, or perhaps the behavior, the boundary that one places up in a professional context, perhaps, what flows through, in absence of the totality of the whole, is what is perceived by the other. And I think that this is what we mean by spirit. Now, I think in common parlance we have other uses for the word spirit. It could mean strength of will. But even then, again, it is an essence. It is something of their character that we can ascertain. Even if we know somebody well, they still have this spirit about them. This through line, this connecting type of thing. The spirit, I think, of somebody that we know well certainly develops, as opposed to somebody that we have just met. Better it is to be of a humble spirit with the lowly. Lowly, seemingly a bizarre word to use when we are thinking of better, something being better than. Lowly, an interesting word to use when we are considering the quality of being and the betterness therein. Lowly, an interesting word to apply to a person, at once seemingly insulting, but at another instance seemingly innocent and kind. But how can this be? From what vantage point can we see both of these perspectives? Well, perhaps when we light a fire, we may light it for a particular purpose. I think of my own experience when I went to a friend's house. We lit a fire to burn. We were doing some yard work and we were burning some wood. He moved into that house a couple of years ago, and there were some wood planks in his garage that we decided to burn to get rid of it. Now, our fire had a particular purpose. We were burning some stumps, but also some planks that were left over from the previous homeowners. Now, let's say, for example, there was a fire next door, that the neighbor made a fire, but this fire was made for a different purpose. This fire was made to cook food on. Certainly we can perceive of that smoke all the same. And we understand that there is a fire there, but it is a different spirit. For that spirit is directed by the purpose of that fire. And unlike the fire, well, maybe that's not true. I was about to say unlike the fire, we are unable to differentiate between the two types. But if one is cooking, certainly we would be able to smell the food along with the burning of the coals or whatever, versus just burning the wood from the yard. So in that sense, the analogy stays true. And so I think in this manner, there's a bit of discernment here when we talk about the humble and the lowly. The lowly is perhaps not directly equivalent to the humble. They are of a similar spirit, but they are not the same fire. Now, I don't make the case that they are not the same fire, that they are not the same spirit, because They are fundamentally different from one another. But I think that the lowly is afforded a certain characteristic, a certain way about them that unites with this spirit of humility. And in some sense, the simplicity that is associated with the lowly, of low status, of low social status, they are necessarily forced into a state of humility of mind. That is a state of acceptance, a state of surrender, because of their lot in life, and to be content with where they are, despite the minimal state of their existence. I think it's a quality that they share with the humble. For the humble of any other condition, they would have to reach such a state of acceptance and of sacrifice that the lowly possess just by virtue of their birth, that I think it's in some sense more difficult for those that are not of that status, of that lowly status. Now, of course, we're talking of the righteous that are lowly. There are plenty of people that may be lowly that are not righteous and do not share in this type of spirit. So this uniting principle, we must say, of the righteous and of the discerning person. But even of the foolish, I think there is a quality, if he is to be of a lowly person, and to be of understanding, that even this person, this foolish person, with a degree of understanding, will possess that spirit when compared to someone of a foolish disposition in a condition that is other than that of the lowly. Better it is to be of a humble spirit with the lowly than to divide the spoil with the proud. Now, these goods, I think, could be seen as something that is taken, the word spoil. It's an interesting word to use here. Now, the first thing that comes to mind is the modern-day American experience, the result of the liberation of man, the burdens of freedom that have been placed on his shoulders and what he has done with it. How the freedom of market and of enterprise has shaped his free society. You know, often I think about where we are and success as it is seen by many, and I have to wonder, well, what is success? What does that mean? And I often find myself unable to admit myself into a state of acceptance even to those who have amassed mass fortunes, for they have had to make an unethical trade at some point, and perhaps it's unfair. We all have to do it. I myself have done it, so who am I to judge? But by the same token, the first half of this verse, better it is to be of a humble spirit with the lowly, this I see very little of, than to divide the spoil with the proud. I see a lot of this, to divide the spoil with the proud. That is, those who attempt to be humble, and yet the spoil that is before them is wrought in this rape, in this bizarre relationship that man has to his liberated mind and will. In some sense, it is what he has done to that relationship is he has raped perhaps the idea, I'm not exactly sure what, his potential, his freedom, His liberation, I think, built on top of those greedy souls, or perhaps I should say his liberation and the persistence therein that persisted on top, through and above, on top of the greed of others, and as it began to continue to exist upon that greed and the formation of various institutions, that he has now found himself in this place of spoil. There is a lot to be had, a lot to be taken. One can pursue a career in finance and marketing and business, and yet all he was able to do in such environments is to take the spoil and to divide it among the proud, those who are after themselves and care not about the community. An unfortunate situation that has befallen the liberated man. It's not immediately clear exactly what the solution is. But when he remains with those who have made the sacrifices, whether by intention or by circumstance and condition, I think he is saved from a lot of this dealing with that of the proud, with that of those that are inflated, internally inflated. The ego and the self are magnified. Perhaps the mind is abstracted from the body. Their place in reality is a circus. They have some delusional understanding of their place in the world. And I'm quick to say they before I say I. Certainly I must be, if all of us are to, at least to a degree, fooled by this sort of thing, I must be well within that. And certainly I struggle with it. It has caused me to be in a state of stagnation in life, and I think that this is the condition of some, not of all. Certainly many have either chosen to be of the lowly or be of the proud. Perhaps it's not that clear and cut, but the minefield is before us in the modern day, where the choices we make are wrought with difficulties. Perhaps that has always been that way, but it seems as though the difficulties today are so severe that it makes one question, well, why are we doing it today? Why are we doing it in the way that we are? Shall we change things? Ought we to change things? Ought we to change ourselves? Shouldn't I change myself? He that handles a matter wisely shall find good, and whoso trusteth in the Lord, happy is he. This verse seemingly a saving grace after the last. Handling a matter wisely, with discernment, perhaps this humility, and approaching something with sacrifice, giving up what one must give up in order to see something truthfully and clearly, no matter how painful it is and injurious it is to the self. Shall find good, and whoso trusteth the Lord, happy is he. Whoso trusteth that right way, Even though they may not know what it is, their understanding of its existence is enough for him to be at peace and to be happy. So that is going to end, I think, this first part to chapter 16 of the Proverbs. I'll continue next time and we'll finish this chapter